Hello, Something Guys and Gals. This is Something Guy 912. Lately, there has been a growing sentiment and resentment in the games industry, or in general media, of franchise IPs. Whether that is in regards to the diminishing returns of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the response regarding the attempted franchise flops of Concord and what likely will be Naughty Dog's new IP, there is a presumptuous attitude that festers in corporate execs who think they can squeeze a fresh piece of shit into gold. Even industry titans of yore, like the Star Wars franchise and or the Halo IP, have now become unreliable to turn a profit despite a decorated history of success, even if disdain over who's running the IP into the ground grows. There is a palpable amount of apprehension over the announcement of The Witcher 4, whether that be arguments of meta regarding the main character and how fuckable she may be, what kinds of lore will be flexible to suit this change-up of protagonist, and more simply CD Projekt Red's last major title being one of the biggest crashes of the 2020s and believing this to be a repeat of bad habits. It seems that our media giants not only can't give people what they want, nor can they make new ideas, they can't even garner excitement over a continuation of dormant franchises, as even the announcement of an Okami sequel was met with consternation. Speaking of sequels, that's what I'm going to talk about, as I've had thoughts about the kinds of franchises that captured me when I was much younger, and realizing that most, if not all, of my discoveries came from the sequel. Anecdotal examples for me include, but are not limited to, Diablo 2, Half-Life 2, Gears of War 2, Monster Hunter World, Halo 3, just to name a few. This even expands into more recent titles like Titanfall 2 or most recently with Path of Exile 2. So what has happened that the idea of Intergalactic, the Heretic Prophets being a franchise comes with it a resounding groan? But I think before we do that, you might have noticed that all of my examples were video games and didn't really extend to movies or shows. That's because movies, as being a passive experience, are reliant on your knowledge of what came before it if it happens to be a sequel. It'd be hard to have somebody enjoy Sonic the Hedgehog 3 absent of them watching the prior two movies, even if they could still enjoy it on its own terms, without understanding how the story ended up where it did. Whereas video games being an active experience, you don't necessarily need to understand what came before to engross you into the game on its own terms. It certainly helps, as Gears of War 2 did gaslight me into believing the character Ty Callisto was fundamental in the prior game, and only realizing after playing the first that he was an invention of only Gears 2. Whereas with movies, you could be utterly lost as to the significance of things if it doesn't blatantly remind you of it. A personal example of mine I've always used to avoid watching movies into the sequel was that over a decade ago, my dad took me to see Tron Legacy, as he had watched the original Tron around the age that I was, and throughout my experience I had to keep asking him plot details because I myself hadn't seen the original Tron to fill in that important context. It was so bad that I thought Tron was the name of the digital world that Jeff Bridges' character made, and not a character in that universe in of itself. But we are getting caught in my personal life. Let's get back as to why people are so turned off from many a sequel, remake, and or adaptation. I think this attitude comes simply from the mere assumption that whatever they are making will be turned into a franchise, as opposed to making a franchise as a result of a market demand for it. A noticeable example of this failure to prop up a franchise was the Mummy remake and the attempt to make a monster movie universe with Tom Cruise to kickstart it. It didn't pan out because beyond The Mummy in of itself taking away a lot of the charm and adventure that the Brendan Fraser Mummy movies offered, but the people behind it had no way to ensure a franchise could be made and assumed it would germinate from nothing. All the examples of the games that got me hooked into the franchise were built up from humble beginnings, with no assurance that their initial title would be a hit. Half-Life 2 was most notably a game that managed to succeed despite how much was going against it during its development, from people who wanted to make a sequel not for the bottom line, but to push the envelope of what was considered groundbreaking at the time. I imagine if Gabe Newell had extremely lofty expectations for the Half-Life universe before knowing whether people would be on the same page, you'd likely never associate the radioactive decay of elements with a franchise that still garners excitement of a sequel to this day. Ironically, that is the reason Half-Life 2 Episode 3 never came to be, because of the expectation of making a episodic video game series over something new and groundbreaking. On the other side of clutching victory in the jaws of defeat is Concord, the biggest joke the industry has yet to see. And I think its failure does not come from how unappealing its characters are, although that is a factor, but the fact that game only knew how to copy and iterate from its betters rather than innovate upon them. More importantly, Sony really had the chutzpah to believe that this would spawn their own franchise, that they had made PS5 consoles to resemble the box art of the game, and had an animated show to complement it. In a manner of speaking, they were so preoccupied with whether they could that they never thought whether they should. They were going to have their generic 5-person hero shooter come hell or bankruptcy, and by golly did they, with a life expectancy that fucking horseflies could compete with. The same could be said for attempts at a cinematic universe with the movie industry, whether that was Zack Snyder and his Rebel Moon series, or Randy Pitchford in regards to the Borderlands movie. I'm still recovering from that abject piece of shit to this day. They couldn't tell you how or even why a franchise needs to be made out of anything, but greed and cynicism can blind any sense of reason and logic with enough interference. Sometimes this apathy to attempts at making the newest franchise can even come from things that are presumably successful. The Horizon video game series is perhaps the biggest psyop of a video game IP that I can recall. It apparently sells well, it gets advertised such that it was a compliment to every PS4 purchase, yet I don't hear a soul talk about it unless it's tried to flex its pre-rendered cutscene against another game with a pre-rendered cutscene. I'm convinced that it is because the LEGO tie-in game to it released to a death knell even more drastic than Concord's peak numbers. As for the movie industry, the Avatar franchise has managed to break box office numbers, despite very little in the way of discussion around it beyond the occasional meme image around it. Interestingly, Avatar wasn't even meant to be a franchise according to James Cameron at first, so it beggars belief that he wants to now, for the better part of the next decade, to equally nonplussed reactions. Getting back to Intergalactic, while a lot of the discussion of it has been co-opted into a vicious back and forth as to whether the playable character should be attractive, I think that game and its franchise will fail both because it offers nothing new to the table and comes with it an arrogance of being successful. Neil Druckmann has made it a habit to shame those who would criticize his decisions, as well as painting himself with a petard of visionary, all the while standing on a pedestal made by others who've long left the company. He wants so badly to be seen as Hollywood worthy that he'll believe that he's made it in show business while Hollywood has him sit at the kids' table. So, with the smug and self-righteous attitude that clouds this game, it's no wonder people are compelled to see this game fail just to stick it in their faces. Franchise glut has certainly invaded a lot of the decisions and reasoning behind the kind of media that we are subjected to, but it would only be that way as a result of prior success. The problem is that these people don't know how to replicate it and aren't doing it out of passion first and money second. They can't expect any person to lap up what crock of shit they pumped out simply out of the philosophy of build it and they will come, and they most certainly can't emotionally guilt trip people when reality comes crashing at their doorstep, which is another attitude that I've seen crop up. A growing insecurity from these media giants that they know better and they know what's best for us, when if that was the case, they wouldn't need to reassure us to begin with. These media industries have built unrealistic models based on antiquated metrics and have taken longer to acclimate to audience demand as they spit vile for not taking their shit hand in mouth. For all the talk that entertainment media can't take risks anymore, they certainly know where to take risks where it doesn't benefit them. Bloated production values, dime a dozen celebrities in it just for the paycheck, divisive reimaginings of old franchises to fit modern sensibilities, over-reliance of CGI and high fidelity to mask the ugliness and the finer details, and now we can add generative AI to the litany of issues plaguing these industries. The sequel can be enough if your heart is in making it and you don't care how successful it is in the grander scheme, content with the niche audience that you curate from it. Terminator 2, Aliens, The Empire Strikes Back are all excellent sequels that even exceed the solid craft of the original. Even if their franchises nowadays is like watching a family member rot from the inside, they still had to start from somewhere to even get to that point. Maybe this video has you convinced that franchises in of themselves have a half-life, that they have to monitor closely lest be driven to the point of worthlessness. And I agree. No one is clamoring for a MASH remake or a Leave It to Beaver spin-off show in the foreseeable future. Not that it couldn't be done well, but that it likely shouldn't, because the potential for it to be good in a different era with different market expectations is much less so. But then again, Cobra Kai and Top Gun Maverick were successes relying on a 30-year gap between the IPs they were a part of. So perhaps make it good is just as simple as that. But simple isn't really enough for some, whether it be movies or games. If The Fall Guy and Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown could still fail even skirting these cynical trends, who's to say these industry giants are wrong for believing that making a franchise and building it isn't the minimal viable product? All I know is that it isn't working now, and whatever rut the industry is in, they seriously need to figure out how to get out of it. Because otherwise, the idea of a franchise as we know it will cease to exist.